But first tonight, President Joe Biden has finally declassified intelligence on the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its links to the origin of the pandemic. Intel relating to the Wuhan lab that was once censored or dismissed as a conspiracy theory, now laid bare in black and white. The hotly anticipated document released mid-Saturday our time by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The intel is divided into three areas: the Wuhan's ties to China's military, the coronavirus research performed at the lab, and the scientists who fell sick in the fall of 2019. All of these areas, as you well know, we first uncovered here on Sky News, at The Australian, at the Daily Telegraph, and in my book, What Really Happened in Wuhan. The declassified intelligence includes how China's People's Liberation Army was involved in coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Chinese military involved in coronavirus research. It states, between 2017 and 2019, the WIV funded some of its personnel to conduct research projects to enhance China's knowledge of pathogens and early disease warning capabilities for defensive and biosecurity needs of the military. It also states, prior to collaborating on a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, the WIV collaborated with the PLA on other vaccine and therapeutics relevant to coronaviruses. We first started unearthing the ties between the PLA and coronavirus research in May 2020, as you can see in this Daily Telegraph front page. That story began by saying China's People's Liberation Army has been involved in scientific research co-funded by the Australian government into the origins of the coronavirus, published in medical journals. Again, that more than 3 years ago, May 2020. Our investigations into this topic continued at The Australian. As you can see, this another front page story. We wrote that Anthony Fauci's institute funded research by the Chinese military, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and American scientists to genetically manipulate coronaviruses shortly before the pandemic hit. Again, we covered it here on Sky News. There's an entire chapter in my book about it, and only now declassified and confirmed by the Office of National Intelligence in the United States. The intelligence also confirms that Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers who fell sick in the fall of 2019 had been hospitalised, and they'd been conducting research into animal respiratory viruses. This was our global exclusive here in March 2021, more than 2 years ago, reporting this both on Sky News and in The Australian. And we wrote, Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers working on coronaviruses were hospitalised with symptoms consistent with COVID in early November 2019 in what US officials suspect could have been the first cluster. Is that the three of them were so sick they ended up in hospital. Two intel agencies were cautious about this particular intelligence, saying the researchers' symptoms could have been caused by other illnesses and that one scientist might have been hospitalised in this time frame for treatment of another condition. But it's that intel about the scientists at the lab working on coronaviruses who were hospitalised that we first made public in March 2021, that then 2 months later led to Joe Biden announcing a probe into the origins of the pandemic. The declassified intelligence also states that prior to the pandemic, Wuhan scientists were conducting, and I quote, extensive research on coronaviruses, which included animal sampling and genetic analysis. Again, you would have read this first in the telly in May 2020, when we reported that it can also be revealed the Australian government trained and funded a team of Chinese scientists who belonged to a laboratory that went on to genetically modify deadly coronaviruses that could be transmitted from bats to humans and had no cure. Now, as you can see, there is nothing new in the declassified intelligence, but it certainly vindicates our investigation And it shows that our investigations, our reporting, mirrors what the Five Eyes intelligence agencies were examining. The CIA now says it's unable to determine whether the pandemic began by a laboratory leak or by natural origin. CIA undecided. The FBI and the Department of Energy both believe COVID did start with an incident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a lab leak. 4 other agencies and the National Intelligence Council think human contact with an infected animal is still more likely. None know for certain. The intelligence community remains divided. Yet, we were all ridiculed by Media Watch, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and The Guardian for investigating this topic. Their reports from Paul Barry, Anthony Galloway and others were patronising.
Let's catch the latest coronavirus scare story from News Corp's Sharri Markson.
Virus warfare in China files. Exclusive.
Yes, it was scary stuff, as was Markson's notorious Wuhan lab story in the telly last year. Former Foreign Minister Bob Carr, who is a friend of China, was just as damning, telling The Guardian,
"This is a case study in a species of journalism we can baptise as China panic."
That one of several Media Watch reports. And tech giants followed suit, with Facebook removing any content that questioned whether the virus might have been lab-created. Facebook only reversing their position after Joe Biden directed the agencies to redouble their efforts to investigate the origin of COVID. Facebook said in a statement, in light of ongoing investigations into the origin of COVID-19 and in consultation with public health experts, we will no longer remove the claim that COVID is man-made or manufactured from our apps. The Daily Telegraph editor Ben English has today called for Media Watch and the ABC to apologise. In labelling this a conspiracy theory, the taxpayer-funded public broadcaster was stifling public interest journalism. Our journalism on this, involving not just me but other journalists at The Telegraph, The Australian and here at Sky News, has led the way in unearthing information that furthered the world's understanding of how the pandemic began. It's a point many in the US and UK have made, and Rand Paul actually makes it again in his interview tonight.
I think sunlight's the best thing for this, and I think the work you've done on this has really gotten us started to do quite a bit, and we hope you'll continue, and we're going to continue here as well.
And his interview a bit later. But he reveals how Anthony Fauci is set to be subpoenaed, so it is quite newsy. Make sure you stick around to have a look at that. But look, this is all, the reason I'm talking about this tonight is not just because the ABC should apologise. This is much more than that. The reason I'm talking about this now, the reason I'm taking the time to underline all of this is because it clearly shows why a new move by the Albanese government is extremely dangerous. Look at this.
Well, the federal government is setting its sights on fake news on social media. Under new draft legislation, social media giants could be hit with millions of dollars in fines if they repeatedly fail to take down disinformation and misinformation.
Millions of dollars in fines if the tech giants don't take down disinformation and misinformation. New draft legislation by the Albanese government. Now, we battled with the tech giants and other media outlets to get out our reporting on Wuhan, to keep going even though we were being bullied. Miranda Devine and the New York Post battled to get their journalism on Hunter Biden out. And now that's led to official investigations and charges. And this was all before the Labor government planned to introduce Orwellian-style laws cracking down on misinformation. Just to be clear, the Albanese government is planning to hit the social media giants with millions of dollars in fines if they don't take down disinformation and misinformation. I'm sorry, but who decides what is misinformation? This is extremely dangerous territory. And 5% of a company's worth is enormous, potentially tens of millions of dollars. The tech giants will play ball with the government. They've already said they're not going to oppose this. So who decides what is misinformation? What process will be followed here? Is it fact checkers like at Media Watch, the supposed arbiter of truth in the journalism industry? Or are the fact checkers employed by the Labor government? If it's a government deciding what is misinformation, then this is government-enforced censorship like we see in China and other dictatorships. And it's not just Wuhan and Hunter Biden that has been labelled misinformation. Something else is now being called misinformation.
Every bit of disinformation and misinformation and scare campaigns that exist in this debate. The No campaign are importing American-style Trump politics, and its weapon of choice is misinformation.
That's Indigenous Affairs Minister Linda Burney saying the No campaign is spreading misinformation and disinformation. So is this why the government wants these laws through, so it can control debate and get its legislation passed? We already saw very serious censorship during the COVID pandemic, and it's all coming out now in Senate estimates. Here's Senator Matt Canavan talking about some of what was censored on my program on Thursday.
So I'm very worried about this because we've seen this creeping censorship come in from the Australian government since coronavirus. We've seen evidence this week in the Senate that the health department here federally conspired to suppress or to try and remove posts by elected members of parliament. This is outrageous, and those posts were just simply criticising government policy. So we have a situation right now, the Australian government is somehow trying to be the policeman of what should be misinformation.
And can I remind you that that censorship happened under a federal Liberal government, a Liberal government that demanded answers from China on how the pandemic started, yet censored any posts relating to lockdown, mandates and a variety of other topics. Can you imagine how much worse this would be under this new legislation brought in by Labor? Would there be anything to stop them calling political scare campaigns misinformation? Could they shut down political attacks they simply don't like? Well, the opposition hasn't yet said that they will oppose these laws. They should oppose them. But David Coleman, and he's the opposition, the shadow communication spokesman, he'll be on my program tomorrow night. He does seem to understand why this is worrying. Here he was on 2GB this morning.
The authority requires the platforms to have rules and procedures about misinformation, and they can decide whether they think those procedures are good enough or not. Now, the risk is that the platforms get worried that they're going to get fined, and so in the process start to self-censor and start to remove a whole lot of content. And some of that content might be content that's controversial, or it might be an unfashionable opinion or whatever it is. But we've just got to be very careful that the legitimate views of Australians on different topics aren't removed from these platforms because it's, potentially at risk of being seen as misinformation.
This is genuinely the single most concerning piece of legislation the Albanese government is pursuing. No government, Liberal or Labor, can be trusted to be the arbiter of what's the truth, what's factual and what's misinformation. That's what Putin, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping in China and other dictators do. We've had Wuhan, the Hunter Biden laptop, COVID vaccines and lockdowns all censored. Would Facebook be fined for publishing the Katie Gallagher, Brittany Higgins story? And those opposed to The Voice who are apparently guilty of misinformation? Where does this end? This is Orwell 1984 level of censorship. Yet the government has the numbers with the Greens and friendly crossbenchers to ram this through the parliament. We should all be very worried.
Designed to use our national parliament to spread misinformation and undermine the actions of Australians to defeat COVID.
And that's why it's important that we have trusted news services. We know at the same time that we have misinformation out there. Misinformation with dangerous consequences about conspiracy theories.
End this madness. This is having an impact. People are dying.